Billionaire Tycoon saw the farmer boy and realized he looked just like him at 17. The black Tesla Model S Plaid cut through the Nebraska countryside like a shadow against the golden wheat fields. Richard Caldwell, 63 and worth $14 billion according to Forbes, hadn't driven these roads in 46 years. The GPS on his dashboard showed he was 20 minutes from Millbrook, population 2,847, the same number it had been when he'd left for Stanford on a full scholarship, swearing he'd never look back. But here he was, returning for his adoptive mother's funeral. Margaret Caldwell had raised him from age 5, when social services had removed him from a drug house in Omaha. She'd been a teacher, never married, who believed in hard work and Sunday church. She'd died peacefully at 91, and her lawyer had called to inform Richard that she'd left him the old farmhouse and 40 acres of corn and soybean fields. "Turn right in 500 feet, the GPS announced in its sterile voice. The Millbrook he remembered was struggling even then. Now, driving down Main Street, he saw boarded windows, empty lots where businesses used to be, and pickup trucks with more rust than paint. The Dairy Queen was still there, and Henderson's Hardware, but everything else looked like it was barely hanging on. He pulled into the gravel driveway of the white farmhouse where he'd learned to tie his shoes, ride a bike, and dream of escaping. Margaret's neighbors had been maintaining the property since she'd moved to the assisted living facility 3 years ago. The corn was ready for harvest, tall and dry, rustling in the afternoon breeze. Richard sat in his car for several minutes, air conditioning running, staring at the wraparound porch where Margaret used to shell peas and watch him play. His phone buzzed constantly, texts from his assistant about board meetings, merger negotiations, a fortune interview. He turned it off. The funeral director had everything arranged, small town efficiency. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., graveside service. Then a gathering at the Methodist church where Margaret had played piano for 50 years. Richard had flown in on his Gulfstream, landed at the regional airport 40 miles away, picked up the Tesla from the local dealership, the only electric vehicle within 100 miles. He climbed out, his Italian leather shoes crunching on gravel. The silence hit him first. No traffic hum, no construction noise, no city chaos. Just wind through corn stalks and the distant sound of a dog barking. It was so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat. The house key was where Margaret's lawyer said it would be, under the ceramic frog by the front steps, exactly where it had been when Richard was 17. Some things never changed in small towns. Inside, everything was exactly as he remembered, only smaller. The kitchen where Margaret had taught him to make pancakes, the living room where they'd watched Jeopardy every evening, the narrow staircase leading to his childhood bedroom. Dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains. On the mantelpiece sat framed photos, Richard's high school graduation, his Stanford acceptance letter, newspaper clippings about his first company going public, magazine covers featuring him as America's youngest billionaire at 32. Margaret had kept everything, proud of the boy who'd started with nothing. But there were other photos too, recent ones Richard didn't recognize. Margaret with neighbors, at church functions, birthday parties. A life he'd missed while building his empire. The guilt hit him like a physical blow. When was the last time he'd called her? Christmas, her birthday? He couldn't remember. His phone buzzed again despite being turned off. Muscle memory made him reach for it before stopping himself. This was his time to say goodbye, to remember. The woman who'd given him everything that mattered. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Nebraska storms came fast and fierce in September. Richard walked to the kitchen window and saw dark clouds building on the horizon, lightning flickering like camera flashes. Rain was coming. The storm hit just after midnight, waking Richard from restless sleep in his childhood bed. Lightning illuminated his old room. The same Cubs pennant on the wall, the desk where he'd done homework, the window overlooking the east field where he'd spent summers working alongside migrant crews to earn college money. Rain drummed against the roof, and somewhere in the distance he heard the crash of falling timber. Old trees didn't survive storms like they used to. By morning there'd be cleanup work to do. At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the air clean and cool. Richard made coffee in Margaret's ancient percolator and walked the property, surveying damage. A massive oak, one he'd climbed as a boy, had toppled across the county road, blocking traffic. A power line was down, crackling occasionally against wet pavement. He was examining the fallen tree when he heard voices approaching. A small group of neighbors was walking up the road, carrying chainsaws and work gloves. Leading them was a teenage boy, maybe 17, with sun-bleached brown hair and work-worn hands already at his age. "Morning," called an older man Richard, recognized as Tom Henderson from the hardware store. "Figured we'd help clear this before the county gets around to it. Could be days otherwise." "I appreciate that," Richard replied, then found himself staring at the teenager. Something about the boy's face, the way he carried himself, was startlingly familiar. "This is Jake Morrison," Tom said, noticing Richard's attention. "Lives on the Morrison farm about 2 miles west. Kid's got the strongest work ethic I've ever seen." Jake stepped forward, extending a calloused hand. "Sorry about Mrs. Caldwell, Mr. Caldwell." Richard Caldwell. The boy's eyes widened slightly. "You're Margaret's son. She talked about you all the time. Said you were some kind of computer. Genius." Richard shook Jake's hand, still studying his face. The bone structure, the green eyes, even the way he tilted his head when listening. It was like looking into a mirror that showed him his own face at 17. The resemblance was canny, almost disturbing. "Something wrong, sir?" Jake asked, noticing the stare. "No, just, you remind me of someone I used to know." The men set to work with chainsaws, cutting the oak into manageable sections. Jake worked with the focused intensity Richard remembered from his own youth. Every movement efficient, no wasted energy. While the adults handled the power tools, Jake dragged branches and stacked wood with the steady rhythm of someone who'd been doing manual labor his whole life. During a break, Richard approached him. "How long have you lived here?" "All my life. My mom's the Morrison farm, about 160 acres of corn and beans. Dad died when I was 12, cancer, so it's just me and her now." "What are your plans after high school?" Jake wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of sawdust. "College, hopefully. Got my eye on agricultural engineering at Nebraska. Mom says we can't afford it, but I'm working 3 jobs and applying for every scholarship I can find." The determination in his voice, the quiet desperation of someone fighting for a future. Richard had sounded exactly the same at that age. Margaret used to tell stories about him working dawn to dusk, studying by flashlight, refusing to accept that poverty was permanent. "What kind of work?" Richard asked. "Harvest crew for Henderson's farm, weekends at the co-op loading feed, and I fix small engines out of our barn. Lawn mowers, chainsaws, anything with a motor. Taught myself from YouTube videos. Self-taught, resourceful, determined to escape through education. The parallels were impossible to ignore." "Jake," Tom called, "need your young back over here." As the boy jogged away, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Recognition of himself in another person. Not the billionaire version, but the scared, ambitious kid who'd clawed his way out of rural poverty through sheer willpower. By afternoon, the road was clear. The neighbors dispersed with handshakes and promises to help with harvest if needed. Jake lingered, apparently wanting to say something. "Mr. Caldwell, Mrs. Margaret used to tell me about your scholarship to Stanford. How you made it out and built. Something amazing." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Do you think it's still possible for someone like me?" The question hung in the air like the scent of rain-washed earth. Richard saw his younger self in this boy's eyes. The same hunger, the same desperate hope that education could be a ladder out of limitation. Margaret's funeral was everything she would have wanted. Simple, heartfelt, and filled with people whose lives she'd touched. The entire town seemed to be there, cramming into the small Methodist church where she'd played piano for 50 years. Richard sat in the front pew, surrounded by faces he half remembered from childhood. Pastor Williams spoke about Margaret's dedication to education how she'd personally tutored dozens of struggling students, established a small scholarship fund, and never stopped believing that every child deserved a chance. Several former students stood to share memories. Margaret had loaned textbooks, driven kids to college interviews, written recommendation letters late into the night. She saw potential everywhere, said Sarah Chen, now a doctor in Omaha, who'd been one of Margaret's ESL students. When I was afraid to speak English in class, Mrs. Caldwell stayed after school with me every day for 6 months. She said speaking with an accent wasn't a weakness. It meant I was smart enough to know 2 languages. Richard found himself crying for the first time in years. Not the polite tears of obligation, but deep, chest-shaking sobs of genuine loss. Margaret had given him everything: stability, education, unconditional love. And he'd repaid her with decades of neglect. Jake Morrison sat 3 rows back with a woman who had to be his mother. Same green eyes, same stubborn jawline. The resemblance to Richard's younger self was so strong that several people had glanced between them curiously during the service. At the graveside, as Margaret's casket was lowered into the Nebraska soil, Richard made a silent promise. He'd honor her memory by finding ways to help kids like Jake, kids like he'd been, smart, motivated, but trapped by circumstances beyond their control. After the service, the congregation gathered in the church basement for the traditional meal. Richard moved through the crowd, accepting condolences, sharing memories of Margaret. People were kind but maintained the respectful distance small towns showed wealthy outsiders. He was Margaret's boy, but he wasn't one of them anymore. Jake approached during a quiet moment. "Mr. Caldwell, I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "Mrs. Margaret used to show me your old report cards, your acceptance letter to Stanford. She'd say, 'See, Jake, it's possible. Richard started with nothing, just like you.' She made me believe I could make it out too." Richard studied the boy's face again, that haunting familiar bone structure. "Jake, can I ask you something personal? Do you know anything about your father's family?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Not much. Dad was from back east somewhere. Pennsylvania, I think. He and Mom met when he was working harvest crews, following the wheat north from Texas. They got married quick and he never talked much about his past." "What was his name?" "David Morrison. But Mom said it might not have been his real name. He had some trouble when he was young, wanted a fresh start." Jake paused. "Why do you ask?" Richard's mind was racing. The resemblance, the timeline, the mysterious father from back east. "Just curious, you remind me of someone." "Yeah, Mrs. Margaret used to say I looked like you did in high school. Said we had the same determined eyes, whatever that means." Before Richard could respond, Jake's mother approached. Linda Morrison was probably 45, with work-roughened hands and the tired eyes of someone who'd been struggling alone for too long. "You must be Richard," she said, extending her hand. "Margaret talked about you constantly. She was so proud. Thank you for coming, and for raising such an impressive son." Linda's face brightened with maternal pride. "Jake's special, gets that? From his father. David was the smartest man I ever met, even if he never got the chance to use it properly." "Tell me about David," Richard said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Not much to tell. He showed up one harvest season about 19 years old, hardest worker I'd ever seen. Claimed he'd been bouncing around the Midwest, looking for steady work. We fell hard and fast." Her expression darkened slightly. "He had some legal troubles when he was younger. Never got details, but something serious enough that he'd changed his name, started over." Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Legal troubles? Drugs, maybe? He'd get real quiet when certain topics came up. But he was clean with me, I know that. Worked honest, saved every penny, talked about buying land someday. She smiled sadly. Cancer took him when Jake was 12. Died owing more in medical bills than we'd saved in 15 years. The pieces were falling into place with disturbing clarity. A young man from the East, legal troubles, changed identity, arrival in Nebraska about 18 years ago. The timeline matched perfectly with something Richard had tried to forget, a scandal that had nearly destroyed his first company. His younger brother, Danny Caldwell, who'd overdosed at 19 and died in a Philadelphia hospital. Except apparently, he hadn't died. He disappeared, changed his name, and built a life in Nebraska. Had a son who looked exactly like Richard had at 17. Jake Morrison wasn't just similar to Richard. He was Richard's nephew. Richard spent the night walking Margaret's property, his mind churning with revelations. Every detail fit. Danny's disappearance 18 years ago, when Richard was building his first tech company, and too busy to look for a brother who'd caused nothing but trouble. The overdose report had been wrong, or Danny had faked his death to escape drug debts and legal problems. David Morrison had been Danny Caldwell. By morning, Richard had made his decision. He needed to tell Jake the truth, but carefully. The boy deserved to know his heritage, but Richard also needed to understand what kind of man his brother had become before he died. He found Jake at the Morrison farm, a modest operation with a white farmhouse that needed paint and fields that looked well-maintained despite limited resources. Jake was in the barn, rebuilding the engine of an ancient John Deere tractor, tools spread across a makeshift workbench. "Impressive setup," Richard said, examining the organized chaos of parts and equipment. "Thanks. Dad taught me most of what I know about engines. He was real good with mechanical stuff." Jake wiped his hands on a rag. "Mom said you wanted to talk to me about something?" Richard had rehearsed this conversation all night, but now, facing his nephew, the words felt inadequate. "Jake, I need to tell you something that might be hard to hear. About your father." The boy's expression grew wary. "What about him?" "I think David Morrison was my brother Danny." Jake stared at him for a long moment. "Your brother?" "Danny Caldwell. He was 5 years younger than me. Struggled with addiction, got in trouble with the law. 19 years ago, he disappeared after what we thought was a fatal overdose. But the timeline matches. He would have been about 19 when he showed up here. That's impossible." But Jake's voice lacked conviction. Richard pulled out his phone, showed Jake a photo from his Stanford graduation. In the background, barely visible, was a teenage Danny, thin, haunted-looking, but unmistakably sharing the same bone structure that Jake carried. Jake studied the photo intently. "He looks like you, like me at that age. We're family, Jake." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of wind through the barn's loose boards. Jake set down his wrench, his hands shaking slightly. "If that's true, then why didn't he tell us? Why change his name?" Richard sat on a hay bale, choosing his words carefully. Danny had problems: drug addiction, theft charges, assault. He was running from something, probably dealers he owed money to, maybe worse. Changing his identity might have saved his life. Mom never knew? I doubt it. If Danny had told her the truth, she might have turned him in. There was probably a warrant out for his arrest. Jake turned away, staring out at the fields his father had worked. So everything he told us was a lie? Not everything. The important parts were real. His love for your mother, his dedication to this farm, the way he raised you. That was genuine. How can you be sure? Richard stood, walked to where Jake was standing. Side by side, the family resemblance was unmistakable. Because you turned out exactly like he would have wanted. Honest, hardworking, determined to build something better. Danny might have started as a lie, but David Morrison became a good man. Jake's shoulders sagged with the weight of this revelation. Does this change anything? Between us, I mean? It changes everything, Richard said quietly. You're not just some kid who reminds me of myself. You're my nephew. Your family. The words hung in the air like a promise. For the first time since arriving in Nebraska, Richard felt something besides grief and regret. He felt connection, responsibility, hope. What does that mean? Jake asked. It means you don't have to do this alone anymore. College, your mother's medical bills, the farm, whatever you need. Jake turned sharply. I don't want charity. It's not charity, it's family. Richard smiled for the first time in days. Besides, Margaret would haunt me if I didn't help you get to college. She was already planning to co-sign your student loans. They stood together in comfortable silence, uncle and nephew, two generations of Caldwell men who'd learned that sometimes family found you in the most unexpected places. 3 months later, Richard was back in Nebraska for Jake's high school graduation. The boy had been accepted to the University of Nebraska with a full academic scholarship, engineering program, just as he'd dreamed. But more than that, he'd gained something invaluable: knowledge of where he came from. The months had transformed both their lives. Richard had established the Margaret Caldwell Educational Foundation, providing scholarships and mentorship for rural students across the Midwest. Jake had become his first recipient, and more importantly, his nephew in truth as well as blood. They'd spent hours talking about Danny, piecing together the man he'd become after leaving his troubled past behind. Linda Morrison had shared stories of a devoted husband and father who worked dawn to dusk, never touched alcohol or drugs, and died holding her hand while whispering about the bright future he saw for their son. Danny found his redemption here, Richard had told Jake. In this town with your mother through you, he became the man he was meant to be. The graduation ceremony was held in the high school gymnasium, the same building where Richard had walked across the stage 46 years earlier. Jake was valedictorian, his speech focusing on the power of education to transform lives and the importance of community support. "We don't succeed alone," Jake told his classmates and their families. "Every one of us is here because someone believed in us, invested in us, refused to let us quit. My father taught me that work has dignity. My mother showed me that love makes any sacrifice worthwhile. And Mrs. Margaret Caldwell," his voice broke slightly, "she taught me that knowledge is the one thing no one can ever take away from you." After the ceremony, Richard found Jake packing his truck for the move to Lincoln. The old John Deere was running perfectly, the barn organized and clean, the farm ready for the new tenant who'd worked the land while Linda Morrison started her job as the foundation's regional coordinator. "Nervous?" Richard asked. "Terrified," Jake admitted. "I've never been more than 50 miles from home. That's normal. I threw up twice before my first Stanford class." Jake laughed. "Really? Really? But you know what Margaret told me before? I left for California?" "What?" She said, "Richard, you're not leaving home behind, you're carrying it with you. Every lesson, every value, every person who loved you, that's your foundation. Build on it." They stood together in the barn where Jake had learned to rebuild engines, where his father had passed down the mechanical skills that would serve as metaphors for fixing anything broken in life. "I want to come back," Jake said. "Suddenly, after college, maybe graduate school, I want to help other kids like us. Like us? Kids who need someone to believe in them. Kids who think they're stuck because of where they started." Jake smiled. "The foundation is just the beginning, isn't it?" Richard felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. "Yes, it's just the beginning." As they drove toward Lincoln in convoy, Jake's old pickup followed by Richard's Tesla, Richard thought about the strange circles life drew. He'd returned to Nebraska to bury the woman who'd saved him, only to discover he had a nephew who might save himself. Margaret would have loved this ending, a family reunited across generations, a farm boy heading to college, and a billionaire who'd remembered that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. The road stretched ahead, leading toward futures neither of them could fully imagine. But for the first time in decades, Richard Caldwell wasn't driving alone. Behind him, in an old pickup truck that ran on determination and dreams, followed the next generation of his family, carrying forward the best of what had come before, while building something entirely new. The Nebraska sky stretched endless above them, vast with possibility,